All right, everybody! Welcome! I'm going to talk over your conversations until they don't exist anymore. Sweet! That only took one sentence. You guys are great. And we're going to be presenting about great things today. Specifically, we're going to be presenting about making great calls. If you guys wanted to make mediocre calls, I'm sorry. That is not in this presentation. I am Manny. In case you guys didn't know or hadn't seen me before. I've seen a lot of you before at other events, and many of you I haven't worked with yet, so I'm very much looking forward to working with you guys at future events. So if you see me at some, say hi. I'm not that mean, I promise. I would like to talk a lot about how we're going to build a framework for taking judge calls. Now, judge calls is the one thing, the one task, unlike, let's say, working the OR or doing deck checks, that we can be pretty certain that virtually every judge has at least some experience with, because that's the base case for us as judges, interacting with players and assisting them. And while the judge program, and especially the conference circuit, is very, very good at sharing useful tips, sharing things, best practices that people have learned, sharing little pieces of guidance that people have gathered on the floor and put together, I don't know that there was actually a concerted way to teach just what you do in a judge call. Now, different people think with different amounts of structure, so maybe some people don't think about it that way. You just hit the ground running and make it fly. For me, I overthink everything, especially when it comes to people and how people work. So I spend a lot of time thinking about how I interact with players and how other judges interact with players across all sorts of skill levels, across all sorts of experience levels, and across different types of events. And I think I've seen enough variety here that I have an idea of how to put it together. And I want to provide this framework that we can take with us. We can use it for those of us who are still beginning to work more on events, especially larger events. We can use it to get better at handling these calls. And for those of us who already have a ton of experience, my hope is that you can use this framework to reflect on calls you took, or something felt you didn't know, and you felt you could have done better. Hopefully this framework provides you with lenses that you can use to analyze how that went. So before we get to that, I want to talk just a little story to explain why this framework is important to me. So my first job, I was a canvasser. I would go door to door and say, hey, my name's Manny. I'm with Dominarians for Yonhua, and we're raising funds to help make sure that the father of machines is elected as the ruler of all planes. And I would go to each door, say my pitch, finish it, either get a donation or not, and go to the next door. And I would get door slammed in my face quite a bit, and then I would go to the next door and say my pitch again. And what I want to tell this story to focus on is the pitch. So we had what we called at our office at Dominarians for Yonhua, we had what we called the rap. The rap was that pitch that we say at each door. It was written by some high up within Dominarians for Yonhua. It was very precisely worded. I'm sure that there was a legal team that went over talking about how we can solicit people to play Walker Sparks or not. It was also very deliberately worded for what points of Dominarians for Yonhua's campaign we wanted to emphasize. We really had to memorize it. Literally every day that we did this, for the entire summer that we did this, we practiced this pitch, and we practiced it dozens of times per person per day. We practiced it quick, we practiced it slow, we practiced upselling, we practiced downselling. This was drilled into our memory. Halfway through that summer, I was probably reciting this in my sleep to the detriment of my parents. What was useful about that, though, was not that we then repeat the pitch like robots at every single door. What ended up happening is that the experienced canvassers knew where they could modify that pitch. For example, and this is just a very obvious case that I started doing myself without realizing it, I would go door to door, and rather than just launching into the whole thing, I would say, hey, my name is Manny, I'm with Dominarians for Yonhua. We're here to raise money to try to put the father of the full planes. And I would pause with a smile on my face for just a beat, just a breath longer than normal, and gauge their reaction. And based on their reaction, that would tell me if I skip ahead a couple of paragraphs, because if they're clearly not interested, I'm not going to then go into the laundry list of why the father of machines is the appropriate ruler for all things. I'm going to skip ahead to what we're trying to do so that this person knows how they can modulate the rest of the interaction. This sort of thing you can do once you have the pitch memorized as that scaffolding that you can hold on to. That framework lets you know where you can switch things out and how you can tweak things to better interact with people on an individual basis. So that's really what I want to provide. I'm going to go through something with a lot of structure, and it's going to be a pretty dense presentation. But the goal is not necessarily that you do exactly this every single time, and I'm the only judge who's figured out the exact way that all judge calls should be handled. The idea is to give you something that you can always refer back to. So if you're feeling lost, you just want to practice calls, you have something that you know, okay, well, I need to do this, and I need to figure out this, and I need to do this, and I need to look out for this. And if you're already very practiced, when you look back at calls that could have been done differently, or how to get feedback for newer judges, you can think about, okay, well, did they cover this? How can they get to this? How do they look out for this? And how do they use this to respond better to players? So, this presentation is going to cover kind of two areas of things. We're going to cover what a judge call needs, and what a judge call needs to be great. So, before we launch into that, I want to hear from you all first and kind of see where we are. I'd like to start hearing what you guys think makes a great call. So, I'm going to look for raised hands, and I'd like to hear your name and one word, what makes a great judge call? Let's get started.
Leandro, satisfaction.
Satisfaction.
Lene, brevity.
Brevity. Awesome.
Communication.
Communication. Sorry, next one.
Mike, resolution.
Resolution.
Trump, clarity.
Clarity.
Jason, understanding.
Understanding.
Yeah, Rusty. Confidence.
Confidence. Yes.
Joe, respect.
Let's get, let's say two more.
Steve. Acrobatics.
Acrobatics.
That would make it great.
And yes,
Chris, accuracy.
accuracy. All right, so we've got a pretty wide spread. We've got some people who seem to be discussing a little bit of how the call is administered. We have some people kind of discussing somewhat of the content of the call, and we have some people discussing what the outcome of the call is. So I think it's actually very interesting because you all in varying degrees that actually hit on the sorts of things that we're going to talk about. So let's jump into it. First off, just to set the stage, when we talk about judge calls, what exactly do we mean? I want to be clear that I want to address all judge calls. I may end up focusing on some types more than others. But at our base, when we're talking about judge calls, we're talking about the player has requested our presence and needs some assistance. And when we're talking about judge calls specifically, we're not talking about your idol and the players asking where their keys are. We're talking about players playing an active game of Magic or doing something related to their playing event have requested your presence. So they do this for a number of reasons that you're all familiar with. Just to get them out there, we're talking about they usually ask for rules clarifications. How does this work? Can I talk to this? They might ask you to draw the text of cards. There might have been an infraction that occurred, whether or not they know it when they call you over. Or if we're not at competitive, there might be some other type of issue. Frequently, let's say a mystery. They might be asking you to watch your phone for slow play. Or they call you and you go over to the table and they say, Judge, can you take my knife slip up? And that makes some of us sad. But not that much. I do want to focus, though, on one of these in particular, and a lot of my language for the rest of the presentation is going to talk about when an infraction has occurred. I want to talk about this because I think it's I should modify it already, when an infraction might have occurred. And I want to talk about this because I think it's the most complex case out of these, in that there are the most things to consider and the most steps and parts to our interaction with the player. So this is where a lot of my energy is going to be spent using that specific language. But that general approach applies more broadly. So if a player asks you how certain rules interaction works, it's complex. You can use a lot of the same approach. You'll just not need to involve certain parts, such as, for example, explaining the penalty or the outcome of the penalty or why a certain remedy. You can kind of omit certain parts. Like I said, once you have the scaffolding, you know what you need to do. So I'm going to say that for starters, as a beginning point, I think a great judge call needs to be correct, and it needs to be satisfying. That's it. I hope you guys enjoyed the presentation. But seriously, we need the call to be correct, and we want to make the call satisfying. Right off the bat, I want to point out that these are not necessarily going hand in hand. You can have calls that are correct and not satisfying, and you can have calls that are very satisfying and not correct. As a very quick example for two live calls that I've seen at events. I saw a call at a recent event, I think not that recent, at Philly back in November, where a player had knocked a card off the top of their library. The opponent called for a judge, explained the situation. The judge briefly said, all right, we're going to shuffle that in, and was on his way almost before the shuffling was completed. This call was correct. They missed administering the penalty and checking to see if other penalties had happened. But the punchline of the call got to the same spot. This is what policy tells us to do. We're going to make sure that we put that card back in the randomized portion of the library. But I heard about this call without having been present because the other player was deeply unsatisfied. It had nothing to do about whether or not the penalty was there. That player felt that the judge handled that call very poorly. Or you can, of course, have a very satisfying call, a call that you execute very well that happens to be wrong. At a different event, I noticed that a judge was called over when somebody had not gained life while still fighting Grandmaster. This was a term and a half ago. So the judge said, all right, adjusted the life totals and instructed the players to continue playing. They explained the situation very well. The players were both very satisfied. We don't have partial fixes for after the fact life gains, so that call was wrong according to policy. But the players were very satisfied. So satisfying is obviously a little bit more of the complex area, which is why I'm not going to talk about it yet. First, I'm going to talk about how we make calls correct and how we make sure that they're correct. So you want to make sure you're giving the right answer. That's kind of an obvious one, but in the interest of being thorough, I'm going to go through it. And to clarify here, when we're talking, for instance, about a judge call that involves the result of a ruling, the result of a rules question, any rules question has one and only one right answer. But if you're talking about a call where a infraction might be involved, we try to make policy as consistent as possible, but there isn't necessarily the case that there is always one and exactly one correct ruling for every single call. So I want to modify it here and say looking for the right answer or failing that, the best possible answer. So assume that there is one or very close to one correct answer, and finally. And we want to make sure that our answer is able to be explained clearly. And I'm putting this here with correct because, well, we'll get to that later. So, how do we get to the right answer? How do we make sure that you're going to give an answer that is correct every single time we get to the call? This seems a little obvious, and on the one hand, it was like, well, we're prepared for the test. We know everything that we're going to talk about. We know everything that is going to come up, or at least I've studied it well. So I know what the right answers are. But not necessarily. And frequently, I think this has been the experience for all of us at some point when we first started judging and had to deploy this knowledge. Somehow, even though we knew the answers, there was a little bit of grasping around at the beginning. So let's see if we can avoid situations like this. Let's see if we can avoid scenarios where we're at a call and well, I know that there's going to be some warning, but I feel uncertain about the rest. Or, well, you start thinking about whether or not to back up and how to back it up, and you realize that, wait, but I'm not sure if it's this type of penalty or that type of penalty. So let's get rid of all that and replace it with a nice, simple two-step process. Infraction, penalty, fix. And the important thing about this process is that it is sequential. Meaning, step one must be step one, and informs step two and step three. What I'm trying to emphasize with this process is that when you are at a call, the first thing you're going to try to do is figure out what happened. Or if the player just has a simple request, once again, you kind of skip that. But if the player has some situation that they need clarity on, figure out what happened. And if it's possible that an infraction occurred, figure out which one it is. So start going through your head. What is this? What is it? Do the players see extra calls? Do the players draw extra calls? I can use specific language here, but more on that in a moment. Go through those in order and try to just figure out which one it is. And if you get stuck at any step, you know that that's the step that you need to bring in another judge. For instance, if you're not certain what infraction it is, you certainly can't tell the players how you're going to fix it, what the penalty is yet. Because these two, at least with the IPG, depend on that. So if you start there and you know where you're lost there, you need to know where to seek assistance. The infraction, of course, tells you what that penalty should be. So you don't begin by saying, oh, well, I know this sort of thing is a warning. No, you start with, what is it? And then I know for a fact what penalties apply. It's also a neat little reminder to double check for upgrades. And of course, the same section of that infraction also tells you what the fix is. So instead of seeing something like, oh, Judge, I accidentally shoved my hand into my library and thinking like, oh, how do we fix that? No, you start by saying, what happened? What is the penalty, if anything? And what is the specified fix? Instead of beginning with the open canvas of how can we possibly fix this, you're kind of following the guidelines. Now, again, I've said that this language is all very specific to the IPG. And of course, not all events are run at competitive rules enforcement. Some events are run using a different doctrine, which we eventually call the jar. But I want to say that the same process actually applies to the jar. We're going to be using different documents and different philosophy, but in terms of figuring out what happened, we're going to follow basically the same steps. We're going to figure out the type of issue. So we don't have infractions really at regular, but we do have common issues, serious problems, general unwanted behavior, and we do have some categories for those. So figure out what level it falls into. Administer a penalty, very rarely, almost never, but you can give game losses at regular, or most frequently give the polite educational thing away. And apply the fix. This last part is the same. Get the players playing Magic and do what you can to remedy the situation with current policy. And, just like with the IPG, use questions. The first one must come first, it informs the others. I want to take a moment here to emphasize that what you're doing is you're figuring out key things up front every time you take the call. You're figuring out what went wrong. You're figuring out how to teach them to be more careful. And this is actually what the penalty step is doing, because part of the reason why penalties exist at competitive is to emphasize the point that they should not do this again. So we end up with how do we fix them? Now, whether it's regular or competitive, it's the same basic 3 questions you're doing to figure out what the right answer is for any given thing. Now, these are kind of a mouthful, so for the rest of the presentation, even though I'm not strictly talking about competitive route, I'm just going to use the terms infraction penalty ethics. Just as shorthand, but remember, these 3 steps are the same thing for regular versus competitive. And we're talking about professional, you guys don't need to be here. So, how do we make it satisfying? We're going to switch gears a little bit. We've talked about how to get to the correct answer. I'm not going to go much more into necessarily the policy and give specific examples because I want to focus a little more on the general framework. So let's talk about how do we make a call satisfying. I would make the argument that for a call to be satisfying for the players must feel addressed. We want to make sure that we engage with them the way that they are expected to be engaged, such that even if they are unhappy with the result, they could still be satisfied. And I have seen that at events. Players can be displeased with the outcome, obviously because it could be detrimental to them, but they can be satisfied with how the call was handled. And at this point, you will think of yourself not as the same as policy. Don't feel bad necessarily the game loss is being applied. That is policy. But try to make sure that your interaction with the player is as satisfying as it can be. So, how do we make sure the player feels addressed? Well, we have, based on what we did earlier, we figured out the infraction penalty fix. We have all the answers to their questions, so we just tell them the answer. I don't think that's comprehensive. I don't think that's a good enough way to think about how to make sure we make the player feel addressed. And to make an analogy for there, I want to use this little known game that I don't think any of you guys have heard of called Magic. So let's say that we're playing this control deck, and we got a hand like this, which is a hand full of answers. It's pretty good. And our opponent has like 3 cards in their hand, whatever. So we're like, all right, bring it. And they're like, sure. So, Tasker. We got no problem. We got a counterspell for that. So we deal with the Tasker. And we overlook their 0/1 plant token that I didn't have to put here. They attack with it, and they get play wrong. And it brings a buddy. And we go, all right, well, a little silly for spending that counterspell now, but I can still deal with that with Bay Rock now. So let me just get rid of the actual big bird and let waffle for a little bit. I decided no one knows that they have another way Bay Rock, so we want to get rid of their next thing. We just say, all right, let's just get rid of the other bird. And we block that token, so it's closed. And then they put the last card, which is Secret Trial, because of course it's Secret Trial. And now we can feel very, very, very safe. What happened here though? They had 3 cards in hand, we had 3 answers. We had all the answers. Why did we end up falling behind? And the problem here is that we didn't match our answers to their questions. So even though you have the right answers, if you don't match the right answers to the specific questions that are actually being presented to you, you are not actually going to be able to address the player. So let's talk about how we do that. I think there are several ways to make sure that you make the player feel addressed. And I'm going to start by elaborating on what I mean by matching your answers to their questions. So, what are some ways that we can think of to make sure that we match our answers to their questions? And what really does that mean? If you are trying to get directions, let's say, and you ask somebody how to get those directions, if they give you an answer that is just slightly different form than you expected, even if that answer is accurate, and even if that answer could be deployed to get you directions, there's a good chance that it's not going to sink in. When many people ask questions most of the time, they're actually expecting the answer to come in a certain form. And if they don't get it in that form, they're not going to process what the actual answer even was. They're not looking, most of the time, to hear whatever you got to say and consider it as their baseline. They have a baseline, they have an expectation for what type of answer they want. If they don't get it, they could just sit there and be confused, kick it away. And if the player just sits there and stays confused, that's pretty bad for us. Or they might just assert the question and just repeat the same question. We want to avoid this situation because it can lead to frustration. They feel that their question wasn't addressed. We might feel frustrated because we just told you the answer to that. So what we want to do is make sure that we match the type of answer to the type of question. So how do we do that? Include a question in your answer. So if they give you a question that might use some terms slightly differently than you expect, or they give you a question that is as technical as the answer you're preparing, make sure that your answer is on the same level of technicality and phrase your answer similar to their question. Judge, can I cast this spell now? You don't want to be the one answering. You have priority in the end of combat step. Because unless the player knows how to parse that, that's not the answer to the question that they can use. Instead of saying, yes, you can cast that spell now. That does two things. One, it's very clear that you're answering them and they know that they should parse your sentence for the information that they need. And two, it's very responsive to them just on a conversational level. It shows that you're taking in what they say and repeating it back to them. This can be elaborated on. You saw our simple phrasing in terms. So I really kind of want to do this a little bit, but just to really emphasize that. Try to make sure that you think about how they processed it and just reflect that back at them. You can also do that to even if the answer isn't just yes. So if they present the question to you, make sure that you acknowledge at least the options that they're expecting those to be. And I'm going to elaborate on that in the later slide because there's actually a very interesting perspective, very important lens, I would say. Let's talk a little bit about expectations, which is the second way that I think we need to make sure that we meet the player feel at rest. At any given judge call, any given one, we show up, and the players are just like, oh wow, me, I wonder what happens. The player has some expectations, or they might have limited vague expectations, but all this information is useful to us. We need to make sure that we know what the player expects to happen. So if you want to think about what this section is about, you really try to think about, does the player think they know the answer to what's about to happen? Whether this is a rules question, or a policy question, or just something happen. You want to figure out, does the player think they know the answer to what's about to happen? This will inform how we respond to that. And what does the player expect to happen? They might not have a concrete expectation, but they probably do frequently, especially at the higher level competitive events, where we see players who play many of these events. And we need to be aware of that to make sure that their expectations are engaged when we answer them. So, are the player's questions open or closed? Are we using explanatory versus concise language? Are we responding correctly to the player? And as we use our expectations, we can deliver our answer in a way that prepares for how they're going to respond to this question. Now, I'm raising these a little bit because there's actually one of these that I pointed out in the previous slide that I really want to focus on because I think this is a powerful answer. The idea of open versus closed questions. Not all questions are actually the same. And we don't necessarily realize, but the questions we ask, the way we ask them in any given conversation, especially in a somewhat transactional conversation like the judge call, the questions have an implicit, think of it as a talk list. It's very, very vaguely analogous, really loosely to priority. Whether or not the player expects to pass that to you or retain it. Do they want to keep the tempo of the conversation or do they want to retain it? This relates to open and closed questions. An open question is, as you may guess, open-ended. It's not specific. And what this means is that it invites the answer to say whatever they want. An open question is passive priority. An open question might be something like, what did you have for breakfast? Hey, how can I help you? Or, what do we do here? These are all open questions. When somebody asks this question, they're not looking necessarily just for one specific response. They're saying, I'm giving you the talking stick, and you now have free reign to describe and explain what you want. An open question is used frequently for genuine inquiry. Not necessarily genuine, but it's frequently indicative of a simplified open question about inquiry. I'm asking you to tell me whatever it is you feel you should tell me, and I am doing so, then planning to listen. By contrast, closed questions are questions that themselves suggest what their answer is going to be. Closed questions are very specific, and rather than passive the state, closed questions are keeping the state. What closed questions are doing is prompting the answer, not to speak about whatever they want, but to confirm or deny something. Closed questions are very frequently yes or no questions. They can take many forms, but they're expecting one specific answer, and they're expecting that answer so I can take it and use it. I can either ask the next question that I have in mind, I can talk about what I'm going to talk about based on that, etc. Good example of closed questions would be determinism, where are we inspiring? Which is better for my sideboard against red, Firewalker or Leyline what did you think of that movie? Was it alright, or was it like as bad as everyone says? That latter question is a neat example because we use closed questions like that very often in conversation. And even though on the surface you might think this question is inviting the other person to say what they thought of Batman. No, it's actually inviting the other person to address one of the two options that were mentioned in the answer in the question itself. Closed questions are much more like a request. Note, by the way, we're talking about open versus closed questions, but some of these don't have a question mark at the end of them when you get it from players. And it's important to be able to try to figure out which type of interaction the players engage in. If you show up to the table and the player says, Judge, my opponent drew an extra card. It's not a question, but it is a request. It's a closed question. It sounds like this player knows that something is about to happen and knows that it's about to happen to the opponent, and they knew that they had to call you to resolve it. So, going back to how we manage expectations, I mentioned explanatory versus concise language. Open questions can warrant explanatory language in response to that. If the player asks an open question, showing that they have no idea how a rule works, like, I'm lost, can you explain this to me? That's a very direct invitation to explanation. But it might be something like, wait, so I don't get how this works. That's an invitation to actually slow down and say, okay, so what happens is, etc. But if somebody says, Judge, I drew an extra card, you say, okay, cool. So what happens is, it's called, etc. They might start to get a little impatient. They might feel like they don't know necessarily that you're getting to what they've asked you to come here for. When you're dealing with a closed question, respond with more concise language. Also, I mentioned earlier responding directly based on what the player was actually asking. That's where closed questions are important. Look for closed questions to tell you what the player thinks is going to happen, and that enables you to respond directly to that. By which I mean directly state yes or no. Is what they expect that's going to happen going to be what happens? If you don't address that directly and make it very clear, the player might not actually get that's what's not going to happen. Or, just on an emotional level, they might still try to press their case in some sense, just by repeating the question. So if you give an explanation that doesn't directly say that card doesn't get drawn, or we're going to have to remove that card from the so they might interrupt you. They might press that. Or at the end of the explanation, they might throw their brow and look and say, but doesn't it? And just repeat the same question. We want to make sure that faced with closed questions, we directly reference what they expect to happen, especially if it doesn't happen, if it's not what's going to actually happen. And that's why I mentioned preparing for the emotional response. Because if we know that we're about to tell something to a player that contradicts their expectations, then we know what we can at least plan for how to phrase our answer to them so that we reference that. If we know that the player seems to be expecting that his opponent's going to get a game loss with a much harsher penalty, it's actually going to be a warning, we can prepare for it if the player knows that actually the way this is handled is X, Y, Z because of this, or the policy around drawing extra cards is actually changed recently and it's handled this way. We don't necessarily volunteer all that up front because we don't want to just guess what the players are looking for. We can pay attention to the questions and figure out what their expectations are. Obviously, we also want to see how familiar is the player with what's going on in general, or more specifically, how familiar are they with the rules, how familiar are they with the policy, and how familiar are they just playing competitive events in general. This player, for instance, you can tell is very clearly a scrub. He doesn't play as any of those. So you have to play that in front of him, you know what's going on. I have a little story here that I kind of like from actually Vegas. I was at the Nonevent, and I was walking around, and I passed by, I just overheard a glimpse of a judge conversation that began with, actually, damage doesn't kill creatures, state-based actions kill creatures. And I continued to walk by. I saw a couple of chuckles. What's wrong with that call? How do we know, no matter what the situation is, that something's amiss with that call?
The condescending actually.
Actually, it's condescending. Very good point. What other? So some hands up here. Yes.
It doesn't really matter.
Correct. It's inconceivable to me that at this regular realm limited event, some player could have asked a question that required that clarification. This clarification is not something the players are looking for, and there's an incredibly high percent chance that that clarification is way over the player's heads. That's not the level of which they're going to know these rules. So, how do we gauge a player's familiarity with what's going on? This is relatively simple, and I think a lot of people already kind of know what to look out for, but in the interest of completeness, you want to look for what terminology does the player use. We want to make sure that when we're responding to them, even if they seem familiar, we avoid shorthand. I'm going to take one guess. Why do I say we should always avoid shorthand? Even if the player who calls us says this is jury, right? Why should we always avoid shorthand? Yes.
I mean, the opponent may not understand the shorthand there.
Bingo. The other player doesn't necessarily, the other player who hasn't spoken to you doesn't necessarily know it. Also, we don't really gain much by using the shorthand other than a couple seconds. Whereas by spelling it out always, we make sure that we're always thorough. We make sure that even the players have no idea what policy is. They know the words in game violation sounds right, and they can follow along with the rest of it. Address their knowledge base. So this means you get an idea for, and this ties in a little bit to what I was just talking about with expectations, you get an idea for how the player thinks a thing is going to go. And we want to make sure that we are addressing it. This doesn't necessarily mean correcting them. It doesn't necessarily mean using the wrong phrase. They use the wrong phrase. But it means making sure that we keep that in. So, for instance, if a player casts Winsome, which is a spell that says at the end of it, shuffle Winsome into its owner's library. If a player casts that, puts it in the graveyard, a couple turns pass, they come by, they get called, and it says, I don't think that trigger can be fixed. This tells us a lot about their familiarity. It tells us that they know, at least enough about policy movement to know that there are triggers that they can be fixed, even though they're applying it incorrectly. For instance, even doesn't have any triggers. So that tells us a little bit about what type of language we use. And it also tells us that to avoid confusing the player and giving incorrect information, we'll specifically avoid some of that specific language. And if the player ends up further in this interaction, asking an open-ended question like, wait, so how do these triggers work in general? Then we know we have an invitation to say, well, this isn't a trigger. This is in fact just part of the spell's effect. Whereas otherwise, you might not necessarily go down that road. And the last thing I want to talk about, in terms of what it takes to make a great call, make sure we can address the player, is participation. So this might sound a little, I don't know, a little after school specialty, but the reality is that we can really involve the players in every call. And this makes a very big difference in terms of how addressed the player feels by our interactions with them. We invite the player to get all the information we need. So I mentioned earlier, we have to figure out what the infraction is that happen. Infraction penalties. To do that, have the players walk you through it. Now, this is something that's so obvious, you guys all already answered. You guys, when you show up and say, what happened? And that's just an open question right here that invites you to hear from the player. But make sure you continue to walk through them with that. Get an step, so you did this, so you did this. This is helpful not just because it gives you the information, but it helps make sure you don't overlook anything you didn't think to check for. Because the reality is that any given game that we walk into, unless this happened in the first couple of turns, there's always the potential that there's some confounding information that you didn't know about. So, make sure the player feels involved in the rule just by having them help us very friendly, walk us through exactly how. So, remember, we're trying to get this infraction kind of in space. Have the player help you out with that. Use your open questions to fill in gaps. So now that I've explained what the difference between open and closed questions are, you can think a little bit more about what types of questions you employ. If you show up and the player doesn't tell you enough of the rule, don't follow up with your closed question. You need to just gather more information about what happened. Start with an open question. Don't start with, wait, so you just cast that lightning bolt, right? Start with, walk me through what happened. You drew a card, and then dot. Whereas, if you're just at the point where you're repeating the story to the players to make sure that we're all on the same page, use closed questions to get a more concise answer. Prompts, all right, so you cast lightning bolt, and the other player said, okay, is that right? Once you've repeated this story to the players, get their sign-off on it. This kind of wraps up everything that we talked about. It makes sure the player buys into your assessment of what's going on. It helps you make sure that you've confirmed that you have all the information you need to make the move. It helps make sure that the player agrees with the first defense. And obviously, around here is the point where if the two players don't agree, you know that you need to separate them and you need to have different types of conversations. But if that's the case, you just go through the same process with each of them. So these things together help make sure that you have everything you need to do is something. And it also helps make sure that at the end of the ruling, the player is given a binary decision. They know that they either accept it or if they just really want to they know at this point they need to appeal. The goal of this participation is to try and minimize the points at which the players continue to give you new information after you try to give the ruling. At that point, they're trying to continue to argue the ruling. But the reality is that if there's any information that the player has that's relevant to the ruling, you need to get it before you deliver the ruling. So this fits into that process that I said earlier about making sure you have all the information up front. And again, do all this up front. Even if the ruling is super simple, you already know what the answer is going to be. Again, do all this up front, even if you know already what the answer is going to be. Think back to that earlier example I gave, where the judge heard that a car was flipped over, and someone looked, took it to the employee business, said shuffle it in, and the other player did not be satisfied. That's because this judge didn't engage with these players at all. That's part of why I would say these players didn't feel satisfied with what happened, even though the outcome was correct. It could take a couple of years, but if it takes too long, that's what extensions are for. You just sit down, walk through, right, so you just have the car up through other. All right, cool, so what we're going to do, and proceed with this. So let's see if we can put this all together. So I went through a lot of things. I know this was very dense so far. But let's take all these ideas and think about how we turn this into a framework that, like the map that I mentioned at the beginning, you apply at each door, at each table that you go to. So we talked about matching your answer to the question, we talked about citations, we talked about familiarity, we talked about participation. How do we bundle all this together? How do we turn this into something concrete and actionable? Let's go back to a fraction penalty. Up front, this is the information we need to have to be able to deploy when we give a ruling. So we need to figure this all out in front. So we're going to try to figure this out at the beginning. This is our first step. We show up, and we have to figure out what's going on, what went wrong, what penalty you have, if anything, and how do we fix it. So that's fairly easy. You begin that by asking some open questions. Hi there, how can I help you? Is the most common open question. It just starts off the conversation, and depending on their answers, you follow up. Maybe they start giving you some open responses, and while they're talking to you, you are listening for what their expectations are, and how familiar they are with the situation they're in, how familiar they are with tools, with policy, and with playing at large events, and how interaction with the judge might play. So you are actually passively extracting this knowledge once you know how to look out for it. You're getting a feel for what they expect the answer to be, if they have an expectation for how the ruling goes at all, and what sorts of language you use to make sure you match their knowledge level when you respond to that. So you're getting this, then you want to confirm everything you know. So once you've started getting this explanation for them, once you think you have all the information you need, confirm it to make sure that's true. So we use some of our friends to close questions to get that specific information you need from the players to make sure you have everything that you need to deliver for them. Think you some closed answers? Good. Now, our smiling half judge has sucked into his brain all of the information they need in order to actually deliver the ruling. So, all that's left is actually just delivery. Which, now what we've done is we've actually front-loaded a lot of difficulty in how to deliver it. Because we figured out up front the content of the rule, what the answers in our hands are. We noticed what their expectations are, how familiar they are with the rules, etc. And we got their buy-off on it. They participated, they confirmed with us, they've given everything they need. And ideally, in doing it, we cut off possibilities for more problems when we deliver the ruling. Once we've got their buy-in, for example, we're much less likely to have issues where we try to deliver the ruling, the player starts saying, but I did this all in the game before, etc., etc. So now, we just take that information and we use the magical power of vibration and sound to put it in the player's heads. We deliver it. And we deliver it always in this order. And again, this goes back to the idea of the wrap and a framework. So we spent a bunch of time figuring out this information, use this order to know what we need to figure out what we're going to say. We deliver it in this order. And by delivering it always in this order, it again makes it easier for us to think what we need to adjust at any given point, without instead being like, oh, well, I know the player's going to be upset, so I should start by saying, don't worry, it's only a warning. No, just walk through. Say, all right, well, what happened here is this is called a hidden card error. And there's a penalty here, but it's going to be a warning, and we're going to resolve it this way. And you can modulate your language to make sure that you're addressing the player in all the ways that we discussed, and make sure we're matching our answers to their questions. But we can also make sure that we're actually covering everything. So we talked earlier about great rulings need to be correct and need to be satisfying. We can ensure their correctness more consistently by making sure we're hitting all of this in the same order. And we can ensure they're satisfied by following this whole framework to make sure that we figure out the ways in which we want to engage the players and make sure that we engage with them. So that, in a nutshell, all of this ugly text is how we make sure that players feel addressed. Sorry about that. So that is the basic idea in a nutshell. Now, I want to add, I don't want to say some disclaimers, but some last elaborations, and then we're just about to wrap this up. Emphasizing the earlier point, addressed isn't necessarily the same as happy. The player can be unhappy with the outcome, but if you address that, you mitigate what the fallout of that unhappiness is going to be, both in terms of how unhappy the player is, and also in terms of what the player is going to do based on how unhappy they are. So, for example, when you're confirming things over here in this scenario, you might sometimes hear from players where one player is much more certain of a chain, that's the deal. You might hear from players when you ask them, all right, is that what happened? They go, I guess. That's an expression of frustration. It shows that player is unhappy. But it also gives you something important. It shows you that even though the player is unhappy, they don't have any more of a case to make beyond that. They're saying, all right, well, I don't like where this is going, but I myself am confirming that I'm not doing anything about it at this point. So, you'll continue to do the ruling, and at the very least, you sort of deflated at the very least in that case a little bit of how unhappy the player might be. Instead of it being a big surprise at the end, and they continue to argue with you, you kind of got them to sign off on it. I also want to stress here that be a little wary about whether or not you are worrying too much about what the player's is going to be at the end of the ruling. This is an elaboration of what I just said. Much like in magic events, the biggest contributor to whether a player's day went well or not is not necessarily round turnover, hopefully the appearance boards are. If that player went 9-0, they had a pretty great day, and they're unlikely to write an article about how terrible that event was. Similarly, a big contributor to how happy a player is at the end of the ruling didn't go well for them. But failing that, the next contributor to how well that ruling actually went as a human interaction is how well you can engage them. And that's really the big punchline I want to make. I want to make sure that we think about, at each ruling, how we engage with players, how we meet their expectations, and how we deliver ruling in a way that is as satisfying as it can and is correct each time we deliver it. So that's it. Now we have about 5 minutes left. So either we can talk about some rulings, and I can give some quick case studies to illustrate this a little bit more, or we can open up questions, since I know I just threw an enormous wall of text at you guys. Would you guys like to ask questions? Would you like to hear a little bit more about this? Here's a question.
I just wanted to bring up a specific, it's more a specific subset of questions that players tend to ask that there was a conversation with any of you who are participating in Slack. That's going on the working Slack. Also, shameless plug in Slack. You should participate in it. About general questions such as, can I spell Skype now? How would you go about determining what is the best course of action to answer that question in a satisfactory and correct manner?
It's a very good question, and it's something I thought about as well. So you want to make sure that we're not giving assistance to this player. If you think about it, the way we're trying to approach figuring out how we answer that question is using a lot of the same ideas. One of the biggest ones, obviously, that we're aware of most quickly is what their expectation is. For example, when a player asks, can I spell Skype that? Most of the time, you know that what they're saying is, can I change the target of that to spell Skype? So knowing what that expectation is lets you try to maybe translate that question. You can also ask further questions following that to try to elaborate, to get a real feel for the familiarity, so that you understand if you can respond appropriately to that familiarity, or if you're responding too much, giving too much guidance. So you can use some open questions to try to get them to rephrase it. What do you mean? Or walk me through the exact situation. So that's I like that one in particular when I'm confronted with questions like that. Walk me through the exact situation. Gets the players to instinctively be a little bit more specific without necessarily cluing them that I need you to be more specific. And if it gets to that, at the end of the day, if you get to the end of it and you don't know if you can answer that, get them to rephrase it. These are lenses. These are perspectives that you can apply to try to figure out what the best thing to do is. They're not necessarily guidelines of what you must do every time. Like the rap, you will be at certain situations where you realize, I need to not say this, or I need to not do this. But these perspectives help make sure that, like following the IPG, like following the policy document, you have a consistent flow with decision points that help you consistently reach one or the other. I saw another question right here. Oh, well, my eyes deceived me. Any other questions? Yes.
I just want to jump into, you mentioned asking the question, what do you need? And just to me, that feels a little too close to trying to guide them toward, like, just because you are kind of guiding them towards asking the correct question, but the question that's asked, like, can I target the spell with Spellskite, is a completely legitimate question.
So, is the question, let's assume hypothetically that in this situation, the verbatim question that the player asked was, the CJ said, can you Spellskite that? Yeah. I don't think that question actually translates to, can I target that with Spellskite? So, if you want to think about it in terms of whether this is guiding them too much, think about it this way. That question is not technically accurate, and therefore we need to know what the specific question they're actually asking is. So we need to know what their actual question is, then we can definitely ask them to phrase the question in a way such that we understand what they're really asking. And we can do that using some more neutral language so that we're not straight up saying, I can't answer that without giving you guidance. Please rephrase your question. But I think it is a valid case to be made that if they just ask, can I Spellskite that, we don't necessarily have enough information to know what the actual question they're asking is. So what do you mean? Or a different way to phrase the basic idea of what do you mean, I think is a valid way to get them to phrase it. I'm still, yes. Back there in the center, and then we're going to get two last ones. Provided the last one isn't actually open conversation because I think we're just about out of time.
Right, so my quick follow-up on that, because I was thinking is on that side of things. Also, you just know when you're at the table, like, trust. Humans are very good at interpreting how they can make their question. You can figure out what they mean. Trust your feelings on that sort of thing. If you know what they're asking, you know what they're asking. So I'm just asking, hypothetically, while we're staying on the whole topic, let's say that a player asks, can I Spellskite that? And you say, you rephrase the question, all of that, and they say, can I target this spell with Spellskite? Would you consider it giving them assistance if you answered their question maybe a little bit more thoroughly than how they asked it? For example, saying you can target any spell that they target with Spellskite regardless of whether it redirect the damage to Spellskite or whatever. Like, would that be acceptable, or do you think that would be guiding them too much?
So I think a lot of this situation is now delving into specific questions and specific things that players say. So I don't want to necessarily give like a concrete answer of this is too much and this isn't. But to answer your question, I would say if the player had asked you specifically, can I target that with Spellskite? A, that's a concrete question that you can answer. B, how you answer it is affected by some of the topics I mentioned. If you just say yes, and you know that what the player thinks the question is can I change the target, then you have a little bit more risk. And when they try to do it, when you stay and watch the table, for them to try to do it, and it goes wrong, they're going to feel a little betrayed. Whereas if you answer, for instance, yes, you can target that spell with Spellskite, and you watch, they do it wrong, and you can refer to that. You can explain how I addressed your question specifically, and I can explain how the specifics mean this. So you can watch out for what their expectations are. Unfortunately, we had the last question here in the corner. So Steve, you get to actually steal the last question And
I was
then,
gonna say, like, if they ask, can I target them with spell study, you can also answer, you can target any spell or ability with spell study. But then they'll be like, I would be more specific to my question.
so I think we're starting to get into a little bit of personal philosophy, how we want to handle that, which is cool, but we're now 2 minutes over. So it's the end.